Hello,
Hello,
Alex.
Sebastian, and hello, dear listeners. It's our episode number 5, and
Yes.
today we have kind of a bunch of related topics we would like to talk about it. So I'll probably start with a small intro, and we can see where this conversation will lead us.
Please.
There is a topic which is not frequently discussed among people who are concerned with personal liberty, autonomy, and this is about what does it mean to be free inside? What's the individual freedom inside of us? What I would like to talk about today, how can we achieve the state of internal freedom, which is also related
Yeah.
to how we perform, how we don't excessively control ourselves, and how we achieve certain kind of state of flow, the way Mihai Csikszentmihalyi described it, and how we remove the inhibitions that typically people have.
And how playfulness, creativity is connected
Yeah.
to those topics as well, right?
Yeah. So one thing I've noticed is that a lot is dependent on the kind of mental model that we have of who we are. So there's this Freudian idea of id, ego, and superego, where it needs to be basically controlled by more socialized ego. And when people do hold this mental model, they choose certain kind of behaviors and they reinforce certain kind of dynamic inside of them. And that leads to certain kind of way they approach their lives, their goals, and so forth. And for example, internal oppression and internal inhibitions, it's very obvious for us when like half of our income is taken as tax, or certain things we are not allowed to do based on laws that exist in a country. But it's much more difficult to assess what is the internal pressure. What are the things that we do not allow ourselves to pursue internally? So I think sometimes this internalized self-controller is maybe even more controlling and more restricting than the external ones.
Not aware of it, right?
Yeah.
So the conditioned maybe into it or never did it differently, or that's our modus operandi in a way, how we treat ourselves or put ourselves in the world.
What I noticed is very often the way people approach goal setting and achieving goals is basically by willpower. And willpower by itself is not bad, but there are only certain things that we can achieve with discipline and control. And there are certain things that cannot be achieved by this kind of internal discipline, by willpower, by pushing yourself. A very obvious example is that you cannot push yourself to go to sleep. So certain things we need to allow to happen rather than make happen.
Or to calm down. If you have a panic attack, pushing yourself
Yes.
to
Yes.
calm down is counterproductive.
Yeah. Good example as well.
Maybe dive into some of those topics. So myself, I mostly observe some relationships also to freedom, autonomy in myself between those and being playful and unconstrained, or how much I try to control things. So there's a certain kind of controlling oneself or trying to control outcomes that contradicts playfulness. But it seems I need some control, certain things to make sure that I get outcomes that I desire. But too much control can be counterproductive, and it brings mental rigidity, which playfulness helps to break out of. So I think there's an interesting relationship around playfulness, creativity, control, rigidity, and how that opens up and closes the mind, and how that also changes the attitude to how we meet the world or meet other people, how we treat them, what our dynamics are.
In different approaches, in different traditions, there is this similar idea of basically part of us which is a performer, and part of us is a more rational part who is controlling this performer. Like in a Buddhist, you can think of rider and elephant. What often comes up is that this dynamic of interacting between those parts, the interface of interacting between those parts is crucially important. Because like the rider can control the elephant only so far. And the way we interact with the elephant is very important, because if we are too rigid, we won't be able to control it.
First, we should maybe ask if that metaphor is really adequate. I feel we can't completely give up that picture. But in another sense, it also seems to build a certain antagonism or a certain rift between different parts of ourselves. The question is, there's not a more inner harmonious approach than having the one that beats the other one to go where they want to go.
And I think all mature approaches rely on reconciling both. Then the question becomes how to develop this productive communication between those parts, so that both are listening and interacting with each other. It's possible to achieve the goal in the most joyful but also productive way. And that's the characteristics of flow state, because in a flow state, we lose ourselves. The controller melts with performer. We don't need to pay attention that much.
We lose our second order awareness or consciousness of what we do, which is doing.
Yeah. Not in a bad way, not losing, then coming to yourself and kind of, shit, what did I do? Not this kind of mindlessness, but typically when people achieve this state, it also coincides with optimal performance. So kind of we don't think about what we do, and we do almost the best possible for us at the moment.
But I guess a flow state also means we are content with the flow of events, and we're somewhat quite in touch with ourselves. And that's the case. There's no disturbance in this flow state. If you would go in a flow state and then wake up and say, oh shit, what did I do? Then I guess it requires that we are out of touch with ourselves before, or there was like some disturbance.
Yeah. A different word for losing yourself kind of in a bad way is hijack, like emotional hijack, when we snap at people and then say like, oh, why did I do that? So flow is a different kind of losing ourselves.
Yeah, it's not about acting according to one's affects. It's a more balanced, content, everything is fire mode. And that kind of keeps us busy and occupied in a good way.
And what also is typical of the flow state is people do enjoy it. And people, maybe not necessarily consciously, deliberately, but typically they strive to achieve more of this flow state in their lives. It's very addictive in a way.
Yeah. So the flow state is born from allowing ourselves to, could you say, go into our element or live out our inner impulses.
Yeah, basically there are typical ways to be aware. One is more focused and rationally aware, very instrumental way. And another is more kind of diffused attention, diffused awareness. We have a skewed predisposition to be more in this kind of hyper-focused instrumental way of being, which is also not very conducive for optimal performance. And flow, in a way, is getting back into this diffused mode in a situation where we don't need to obviously strongly focus on some kind of threat or some kind of goal. Like, I mean, hunter-gathering society, obviously, when you hunt and you need to focus, when you are just resting and digesting, you don't need to do that.
Hyper-focus for short term, right? So
yes.
Usually a few minutes. So this trying to stay for 8 hours in hyper-focus is a rather modern condition.
Yeah. And obviously, like, kids are basically made to do that in schools, which is
Yeah.
not very typical, especially for kids. They need to
Yes.
play much more.
So, okay, there's this flow state. What do you think is its relationship to autonomy and freedom? So why is that interesting to discuss for us?
What happens in this state is we reduce the internal control that we have. So whatever this kind of socialized aspects of us that tend to pay attention what we do,
Yeah.
and typically issue those internal or do this or don't do this, it tends to go away or relax a bit. What happens to us is we have complex needs, and in order to act on those complex needs, typically what we do, we not very consciously, not very deliberately, but typically filter out what is okay to act on right now and what is not. So in this state of mind, it's very hard to find the right amount of balance between certain needs that we have. So for example, if let's say in a difficult conversation, I want to deliver some kind of feedback, and at the same time, I don't want to offend this person. So sometimes those internal needs, they may come to the almost like a impasse where you cannot act on it because like they are so contradictory. And similar thing can happen on a physical performance level. So for example, in dancing or in singing or in sports, you need to act and use your body in a very complex way, but it's very difficult to do that consciously. There's this joke about the centipede that was asked, how are you walking? And then it cannot answer because in a conscious way, you don't know what to do. So I think in a way, there is certain kind of intelligence in us which can do certain things which we cannot do consciously. So for example, performance in sport, performance in arts, creativity. We cannot deliver certain kind of discovery at a certain period of time. So it needs to incubate, and only then our subconscious produces certain kind of idea or certain insight that we typically have in a shower or during a war. So I lost my thread right now. I don't remember the questions. I was telling about this old self-help book. It's called Psycho-Cybernetics. And it was written, I don't remember exactly when, 50s or 60s, by a plastic surgeon. And he observed, for example, if someone thinks that their face is disfigured, and basically they stop talking to people because they think that people are judging them, they would come to him, their face is fixed, but still nothing is changed in their lives. Internally, they see themselves as disfigured. Typically, those people saw themselves as ugly. They were creating internal inhibitions and they were not able to act. So he got some ideas from cybernetics, how the system acts and how the system uses different types of feedback in order to achieve the goal which the system is created to achieve. For example, he was talking about how torpedo finds the ship. And there's a goal, torpedo moves. And what's important for torpedo is to act and include the negative feedback. Basically, at a point of time, this torpedo realizes, okay, I'm not on track, I need to correct. And then it corrects. Inhibition is basically like a negative feedback. And when there's too much of inhibition, the system basically needs to stop, because every iteration of considering negative feedback is like stopping for a while, taking in the feedback, correcting the movement, and then acting again. If we stop too frequently, then basically the system cannot act fluently because it becomes too rigid. So the idea that he had, we need to visualize the goal, act on it, obviously from time to time, consciously assess where we are, consider the negative feedback, but what's more important, to continue act and not interpret failure as something
It sounds like an entrepreneurial attitude or startup attitude.
Yeah.
Saying, well, it's important to have this culture of failure.
Yeah, fail quickly.
I mean,
fail forward.
Yeah, just stand up all the time. It's fine to fail. And that goes against the rigidity you traditionally have, at least in Europe and Western cultures.
Yeah. So like this idea about how we are framing control and inhibition as negative feedback, and how can we, and obviously that's the balance game, because it's very important not to avoid negative feedback or avoid conscious control whatsoever, but it's just like how to find the optimal amount of it, how not to make it so frequent.
This urge trying to exercise greater and greater control and then seem to slip away, which is also a mode that brings us today, I would say, in a situation where freedom is endangered, where most people have the urge, if something doesn't go the way they think it should go, to try to not only control circumstance, but other people more and more.
Yeah.
Or when people feel they lose someone, they're just try to cling more, control more, check things, right?
Yeah, the pattern sometimes is that a self-fulfilling prophecy. We try to avoid something so much that we start to create more and more reason for that to happen.
Maybe obvious, but good to point out that it's not the objective circumstances that influence our actions, but our subjective perception of it.
Yeah.
And that this is something that's ingrained and maybe also conditioned into ourselves. So our perception, as many people know, with a lot of discomfort, is often formed in our childhood, our parents, our environment at school. And sometimes even 50, 60-year-old people still carry that around, even though things have long changed. Yeah. So self-actualization seems to be a difficult thing, and seems to be a lot of conditioning that forms our self-perception, which presumably plays on bigger and bigger role in modern society, where we have more and more fast changing circumstances and people moving around way more changing environments way more frequently than they used to.
Yeah. And I think here what's important is to understand where those limitations are coming from. Because when we are adults, obviously we have a lot of data to make certain interpretations about who we are. But when we are just small kids, some offhanded remark by a teacher, and not necessarily they mean badly, and they consider that we are not good at math or whatever, and they make this remark, you are not good at math. And it just becomes like an imprint, which then leads us in a certain direction, because there are certain things that, certain actions, certain classes we don't take, certain books we don't read. And then we can think, okay, obviously I'm not good in math, but it's only because we didn't try. So it's also important to understand where this interpretation or where this self-image is coming from, and from time to time review.
Do you think that's also true for our belief about whether we are free or autonomous?
Yes.
What is that? So what's the consequence of this? You could have a relatively unfree society where people believe they are free. Does that make them more free in a way, or does that help them internally? Or a free society where people believe they are unfree, do you think that holds them back?
For whatever oppressive regime there is, it's going to be useful for them to create as much perception of fake, phony freedom for people to have. So that's definitely going to be reinforced by the systems that want to dominate people. But I think also a lot of ideas about the world, about who we are in the world, they are not necessarily ours, even when we think so. Basically, introjections, the things that were in a way implanted in our heads. For example, if we were told by our parents, be a good boy, be diligent, be industrious. Yeah. These are natural and normal things to teach kids. Are they things that we developed for ourselves as our values or our guiding principles, or they were just in a way indoctrinated, even when they're good?
It seems it's a form of conditioning, no?
Yeah.
So a typical conservative parent conditioning is be productive. Right? Having a bad feeling about not being productive. If you always have the bad feeling you're not productive enough, and you, for example, can't get in the flow, right? So you can't, you fall into a lot of rigidity, and you have those second order negative thoughts, which then also make you presumably believe you're a failure, or you're not enough, or you can't achieve things. So when there's a lot of pressure to be productive, then it becomes psychological self-purpose, trying to feel productive or doing something that fulfills productivity instead of following what you're passionate about or a project that's maybe really worth it, fulfilled on a superficial conditioned level instead of feeling really into you and acting in accordance with what feels right, what you're passionate about. Because then you don't need the drive. The question is if it's helpful to have a certain conditioned drive to productivity, to be of value for others, which is required for, in most cases, for society at large to work.
That's also the model in developmental psychology, is that basically growing up, it's about first conditioning and then letting go of condition. Yeah. So like at first, small kids are introduced to certain kind of rules and behaviors, but then it's our life's journey is to find out who am I, like, apart from those rules? Who am I apart from my culture? And what kind of values, what kind of needs, what kind of dreams and desires I have on my own, and how can I achieve them, and how can I pursue them in a way which is socially engaging and fulfilling.
Yeah, I think in that way, not all cultures are equal, because there's a culture that just helps you to become more who you are. You can build a culture. I want to empower my child when it grows to find themselves. And then there's all the other cultures that just pretend to be something or that have a certain flavor. If I grew up and am brained that it's cool to wear lederhosen and drink beer at Oktoberfest, right? This is putting something I've been conditioned into or what I like onto someone else, instead of helping them to be satisfied to become the person they want to be.
Yeah. I'm not a parent, I don't have kids, but that's probably one of the most difficult tasks, is like how to allow your kids to be their own person and not like what you want them to become.
Of course, you have some things you like, right? You're a person with a certain culture, independently of whether that has been conditioned on you or whether you develop that yourself. You have a flavor as a person. So yeah, it's definitely difficult to achieve, but at least you can aim at either of those. And I think there's both kinds of people. There's a lot of people who want to push a certain culture on their child or on others. On others, I guess you still have that more in Russia, in Iran, dictatorships for sure. In the light version in Europe, and I guess US is, even though not perfect for sure, but where you have this idea of it's not push a version of my life on others, but let's leave it to them. And yeah, I guess there's a relationship to control too. Yeah. So this, I want to control things in my life, it usually extends to other people too. And for control, as I've mentioned to you earlier, I think it's interesting to pull apart what kind of control we are talking about, or what kinds of control there are. Because one thing we can distinguish is internal and external control. So internal control would be I tried to sleep or not to have a panic attack, or my panic attack to go away. Or stoicism, affect control. I try not to be carried away by my emotions. And then there's an external control, like I want for those things in the business to be in place. Or I want to control others. I want to control what my partner does, what my children do.
Mm-hmm.
And for external control, there's a difference between freely wanting to build things and control an environment in a certain way, and then political sense control others. So there's things and endeavors where the builder, the typical Silicon Valley high agency builder, also wants to exert a lot of control by forming the world in a certain way, by building something new. Steve Jobs wanted to control a lot. He wanted to impose a certain vision he has on the world. Or I don't know if impose is the right word, because it's a free endeavor. He didn't force anyone, but he tried to build certain company structures, such as a certain culture, and then asked other people to join. And of course we need, especially in very basic senses, external control. Finding food, building a shelter, that requires certain forms of control. There seems to be a important sense in which external control is important, and it gets, especially for a freedom, autonomy-loving person, gets difficult at that point where you impose something onto the will, against the will of others, or manipulatively in a way they don't know, trying to mold them in a certain way for your purposes out of fear, or trying to force certain actions to happen.
So you mean like there are different types of control. Some are more productive and some are less productive. Some are more coercive. Some are more kind of in partnership.
Yeah, even when building a shelter, there's a certain form of a helpful, healthy control, it seems. And there's a certain too much control usually. And too much control would maybe be trying to almost be perfect, anxious and agitated about the certain form and shape of the shelter, right? I don't find a certain material. I rigidly want to braid the branch to a certain position. I'm not open and playful to building this shelter in a different way. So those seem to be overly rigid form of control. I break everything brutally to my will, which doesn't seem to be that productive.
Yeah, and sometimes we think those more mechanical engineering tasks are more rational, but it also relates to a typical rule for brainstorming. At first, you don't criticize ideas. You just let whatever shit comes up flow.
Yeah.
So you can create as many rubbish ideas as possible, and then you choose whatever ones are more relevant. So even for these kind of more technical and more engineering and more rationally based projects, even for that, sometimes you need to let go of control and just make whatever comes up and then make use of it. So for generation phase and then editing or censoring. Even with those kind of projects, we need to be able to create this kind of creativity, this kind of playfulness, and switch between those two different modalities.
Something that fits in here quite well, I feel, is advice a friend gave me some time ago. He described that ideally we have in our lives time and phases of wideness and narrowness in a way.
Mm.
So in times of wideness, we embrace range. We try to be really open-minded. We look at this and that, and it's like the brainstorming mode. I have this open-minded exploration period, and then I have times of narrowness where this openness narrows down more and more. So to get productively something done or dive deeper into a topic, I narrow that down. But the problem is, over narrowing it down, I'm really productive and maybe progress on a project. But then after days or weeks, the progress starts to stagnate, becomes more rigid, maybe more unmotivated, because I formed my vision and I do this and this now. And then at some point, now I'm just going outside to something and I'm like, okay, where am I? I worked on this for a while, but I lost view of the wider picture in a way. And then I widen up again and have a time of free flow. And even in the building a shelter case, I think you could say that might be a good idea. So I try to build that hut in the moment where I stagnate and I don't really progress with my project because branches are not in the right size and breaking them apart is a lot of work and it's also not great results. Then I maybe go a step back and think, okay, maybe I could build the shelter in a different form. Or would it maybe even be nicer or save a lot of work?
Yeah.
And then I make that change and maybe narrow down again. And I guess this is a bit a shift between playfulness and openness, exploration, and then having some, almost with a bit of discipline, maybe narrowing down, getting to it, and sticking for one thing for a while.
Yeah. And I think it ties back to the thing that you mentioned before, this entrepreneurial idea of failing fast.
Yeah.
And sometimes this conscious control naturally wants to prevent the failures, but then it prevents also the learning by iterating, because we are not making failures fast enough.
Yeah.
We are not able to learn fast enough as well. And that's what I often note when I work with people. When you ask them, what do you want to do? They first start with kind of critiquing what's possible, what's not possible, which is not the best way to start about those kind of thinking processes. So first you start with generating as much as possible, allowing yourself to flow through, as you said, allow this wide attention. And I think what you describe is basically a meta-awareness skill. It's not only about having different modalities of thinking, but having enough awareness of how do I need to facilitate my movement between different modalities. What's the situation right now? Do I feel stuck? Do I need just to brainstorm a bit? Or it's the other way. I have too many ideas and I need to start cutting them out.
Yeah. It is, interestingly enough, at least for me, it's a typical mode of working, at least if I'm free to work on my own terms, to narrow down and then widen up, usually to cycle, depending on the activity, weeks usually. So 1-2 weeks more focused, one project, and then widening up again. And I feel that's the most productive way of working, because otherwise, if I stay in the open period for too long, then I'm just in my mind becoming dreamy and unsatisfied because I don't get, nothing happens in the real world, right? I'm just flying around in ivory tower and in clouds.
Yeah.
And
but also that you describe it almost like there's certain kind of sensation attached. You could almost sense not enough action, not enough movement.
Yeah, because I stay in the open space of possibilities, and maybe, of course, you can practically try things out, but you never get to anything ever if you stay in that open space, because you just exploratively try this and try this and try this. And then if you want to get things done or have efficacy in the world, then narrowing down helps. This feels more like you get maybe somewhere, but then more and more I lose my playfulness, getting more rigid and maybe also a bit more critical at some point, right? If they stall, don't go forward anymore, I'm thinking the same things over and over, not considering different paths. And then I'm like, okay, the moment where I'm like, I just need to go for a walk. listen to some music, open out, get input, let my thoughts fly, to open up again. It's important to, if you want to work autonomously or make sovereign autonomous decisions, that you find a work mode about managing that yourself and being attentive to how to use control if there's too much or too little. And a question that would interest me here, to maybe extend that question a bit to other people now, how to approach other people, how to apply control when being in exchange with other humans.
I'm thinking about, do I want to control them? Do I know what's best for them? So I think that's the idea that comes from my values and probably your values as well. As I want my actions to be aligned with those values. But obviously, sometimes I may be caught up with the idea that I know what's better. And then I'm trying to influence and not listen to another person in personal context, in work context.
But there's different ways in which you can do that, right? There's always this more manipulative hidden way. And there's an upfront way where I think you should do that differently, talk through it and suggest to help them or tell them, right?
Obviously, I'm biased because I'm in a profession which is very non-directive, because I'm by questioning, by sharing perspectives, I'm not telling people what to do, but I help them understand what they want to do on their own. Yes. And I think that's the best way to approach it. But at least one idea is that I need to ask, what kind of help do you need from me? And our typical response is to do something without asking another person, what exactly do they need from us in the moment? How can I be helpful? Do you need anything from me? So these are responses that in which we can, in our jargon, contract for what kind of response they need from us.
There's, of course, to the extent to which you could do that, right? So if you see your wife putting the dishes away in the kitchen and how can I help you? What kind of help do you need? She would be for good reason, just be annoying like, Alex, so either you help me or you just fuck off. Yeah. But right, either you're in touch with that situation and get it or not. There's some situations, or I guess a lot of situations where it's pretty clear. If someone wants help, then this is almost, I call it autistic overcaution. You're not in touch, you don't get the situation.
But the downside here, or the danger, is like sometimes we can assume too much. Sometimes what's important is to pay attention. Washing dishes, for example, if my wife needs some personal time and I just, let me help you. It could be a bit of imposing myself on her. Maybe she needs sometimes to reflect, and that's helping her.
So maybe to wrap this up, we talked about playfulness, not so much about imagination, creativity, then our self-image, control, and how those things relate to autonomy and freedom. Do you have some things to say about those relationships to our self-image or playfulness, or maybe imagination, creativity, where we didn't venture far?
Yeah, what's important is a kind of internal one-to-one meet with the part which is controlling and the part which is being controlled, so that we establish more partnership inside of us. Because often, not always, but often this control is compulsive. We need to control because we are afraid of something. We need to control, otherwise things will go down.
So you talked about the rider and the elephant in the beginning and the close stance of what should the relationship between the elephant and the rider of the elephant be? Or is that another
conversation, a dialogue? Because of what I see is happening is that in negotiation, that there is distinction between position and interest. Position is basically a solution which certain party has, and it pushes for it, and another party also has its position, it pushes for it. And typically when there is a clash, it's because both parties are too focused on their solutions and they quarrel on this level of position. But when we are able to step back and think about what are the interests behind those positions and talk about those, it's much easier to find common ground. And I noticed that a lot of times similar things are happening internally. It's just like our controlling part wants to control because it has certain kind of interests, but they are not explicitly voiced. And the part which is more playful, it doesn't want to be controlled. It doesn't want to be subject to discipline. It wants to eat sweets and drink beer or whatever. It also has certain interests, but they're not explored and stuck in internal conflict. What I'm suggesting is not necessarily acting on those impulses from any of those sides, but being able to talk about them and talk about where are they coming from. This part which wants to drink beer and watch TV, what does it want to achieve? And typically it wants to have some rest, to have some nice times, but it just see one specific way to implement those kind of intentions. So sometimes it's more about how can we explore what are the interests and how can we find a more productive way to act on those needs and impulses.
Yeah. And especially trying to control our inner needs or impulses, at least in a direct way. It usually fails.
Yes. Yeah. Dieting is a very common example. You make yourself just eat the right food, healthy food for a certain amount of time, and then you just go on the binge.
Yeah.
That's a topic for which there are many other facets that we didn't cover today, and maybe we'll return to some of them. Thanks for staying with us. If you have any suggestions, questions, comments, feedback, feel free to share it with us.
Or any suggestions for follow-ups. Well, so please let us know if you want to dive in to any of those topics more closely, and we're happy to venture there.
See you in our future episodes.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.